looking at the key anthropological method that will be sort of the cornerstone of our work together over these 2 weeks is field work. And this is really a very central term to our study and, again, what we'll be doing with our host communities here as well. I'd like to just very briefly talk a little bit about some of the core components of field work. The first is this idea of participant observation. Have any of you heard this term before? Okay. Participant observation, really what this actually means is participating and observing. So basically being involved and engaged in the living cultural practices of the communities where you work. Participating and watching, learning through observing and reflecting on those observations. A second core component is this idea of self-reflexivity. Again, another big term, kind of a mouthful. But what self-reflexivity really means is being aware of your own biases, prejudices, perceptions that you bring as an individual, given your own background, given your own upbringing, given your own ethnicity or whatnot, that we all bring certain biases, and we must be aware of these and reflect on how these shape our perception of other cultures, other peoples. A third core component of field work and participatory approach is building rapport. Yet another anthropological term that really what it means is building trust and mutually respectful relationships in the communities where we work. This takes time and this takes a commitment to develop those kinds of relationships with communities. It's not something that happens immediately or overnight. There's a certain level of investment. And so certainly for people who are more familiar working within the museum or within a heritage context with material heritage, built heritage, instead of focusing on that space, to go out and build relationships with communities. A fourth component is understanding context. Now, this means broadening the scope of our understanding to history, to social context, to kinship, and all of the factors that frame and shape cultural practices and intangible culture. A fifth core component is learning how to identify key informants. Who can share information, who is knowledgeable about intangible cultural heritage, and learning how to interview, how to ask questions and delve and probe into topics more deeply so you can understand them in greater depth. And a sixth key dimension of field work is listening for diverse local voices and points of view. So you're not looking for one definition, the single master definition of some element of intangible heritage or cultural practice, but you want to listen for all the different ways that a cultural practice or intangible cultural heritage is defined. It has multiple meanings, multiple dimensions, and this is really key to an anthropological approach. So what we also want to bring to this field school and to be thinking about all the time over these next 2 weeks are some of the critiques of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention that anthropologists have put forth. One of these critiques is what we could call decontextualization. Basically, in a nutshell, this idea is that many anthropologists have said that once you take cultural practices that are part of living life, part of everyday life, and you start to document them, you start to perform them, you turn them into heritage, that they fundamentally change in this process. They no longer have the same meanings and values and significance as they once did. Once you start this process of heritage revitalization. And an anthropologist named Ahmed Sokunzi has argued this is almost like a recycling process. Cultural facts are alienated from their original context. So this is sort of separation from the context. And they're no longer the same. It says these elements of intangible cultural heritage are not and cannot be the same ever again. So this is a very strong critique, and I think we need to think about this. Okay. And Brown, another anthropologist in the U.S., has said, cultural heritage that is inventoried, declared, an official treasure, and sustained by self-conscious instruction and surveilled by government oversight committees has lost much of the spontaneous creativity that gave it meaning in the first place. So again, this is a critique that once you start the heritage process, it's no longer sort of natural and spontaneous. These are critiques from that we have to think about. Another concern among anthropologists is this concern with cultural appropriation. And this basically means and this points to a certain paradox, that as we document, as we create these lists and document the details and background of intangible cultural heritage, we are paradoxically also making it more vulnerable to appropriation by entrepreneurs. We're making it visible and accessible to a much wider world that can then appropriate and take these elements and in many cases, turn them into commodities. And we've seen this in, there have been cases of, for instance, indigenous music forms, because these elements are in the public domain. They're taken by musicians who without permission or consent, for instance, then incorporate them into their own music. So this is something we have to be concerned about as well. Okay, so the anthropological approach points to a few questions that we need to ask ourselves as heritage practitioners. And that is, how can we safeguard intangible cultural heritage in such a way that fundamentally respects the significance, values, and meanings of those cultural practices? How do we give greater agency? How do we give a greater voice and say to the bearers of culture, to the owners and producers of culture, in determining what and how to safeguard? So that, we're not the experts in determining what to safeguard, but really that this is a participatory process.